When the steel doors slammed shut behind him, they thought the story was over. The echo rolled down the corridor like a verdict already decided. Boots scraped against concrete. Keys rattled. Somewhere behind thick walls, a man laughed. The kind of laugh that came from believing power had finally done its job. In the holding wing of Sing Sing, the air smelled of cold iron and finality. Men didn't walk out of this place with messages. They walked out quieter than they came in, if they walked out at all. But the man standing there didn't bow his head. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood tall, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes calm in a room designed to break them. The guards expected bitterness. The warden expected submission. The politicians watching from a distance expected Harlem's most defiant symbol to finally understand his place. They were wrong, because Bumpy Johnson didn't walk into cages like a defeated man. He walked into them like a warning. The rumor spreading through the city that week was simple and cruel. Bumpy was finished. The machine had finally swallowed him. No more backroom negotiations. No more quiet power. No more man who could make a phone call and stop a street from burning. Harlem, they said, would now learn how small it really was without him. But legends weren't built on rumors. They were built on what happened next. Long before the cell doors closed behind him, Bumpy Johnson had already become something the city couldn't erase. Harlem in the early 20th century wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a battleground dressed in brownstones and ambition. Jazz spilled out of basements. Preachers shouted hope from street corners. Politicians shook hands with one finger crossed behind their backs. And above it all hovered a quiet understanding. Power didn't always live in City Hall. Sometimes it lived on 135th Street. Bumpy Johnson had learned early that respect wasn't given. It was enforced, measured, and remembered. Born in South Carolina and shaped by northern streets that didn't care about a man's dreams, he grew into Harlem's contradictions. Educated enough to quote poetry, dangerous enough that men listened when he stopped talking. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He was the one silence made space for. White mobsters called him a problem. Black politicians called him an embarrassment when cameras were around, and a solution when they weren't. The community called him something else entirely: protection. Because when landlords cheated tenants, Bumpy intervened. When outside crews tried to muscle in, Bumpy responded. And when police raids came down hard on Harlem but somehow missed downtown rackets, Bumpy noticed and remembered. That memory made him dangerous. He didn't challenge the system with speeches. He challenged it by surviving, by operating in the gray spaces where law pretended not to look, by understanding something his enemies never did. Harlem wasn't just territory. It was people. And people remembered who stood up when it counted. That was why they needed him gone. The indictment didn't come loudly. It came wrapped in paperwork and quiet meetings. Prosecutors stacked charges like bricks. Judges pretended the decision was impartial. Newspapers used words like example and necessary. And when the sentence came down, it was meant to be symbolic. This time, they weren't just locking up a man. They were making a statement. They paraded him through the system with extra guards, extra scrutiny, extra smiles. One officer leaned in close as the cuffs clicked shut and whispered what everyone else was thinking. Your kind always think they're bigger than the cage. Bumpy didn't answer. He just looked at him, the way a man looks when he's already counted the cost and accepted it. That look followed the officer for years. Inside the walls, time moved differently. Days blurred, nights stretched. Men tested each other constantly because prison had its own hierarchy. And legends from the outside didn't always survive it. Some thought Bumpy would fade. Some thought age and pressure would dull him. Others waited for him to break just so they could say they'd seen it happen. Instead, something else took shape. He listened more than he spoke. He learned the rhythms of the place, who moved contraband, who enforced order, who answered to who. He never reached for power too fast. He let it come to him the way it always had. Calm, inevitable. The guards noticed first. Fewer fights near his tier, conversations stopping when he walked by, men standing straighter without knowing why. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He simply existed with the same unmovable presence he'd carried on the streets. That unsettled people. Because institutions relied on one thing above all else: compliance. And Bumpy Johnson had never been good at that. Word filtered back to Harlem slowly, then faster. He wasn't broken. He wasn't begging. He wasn't done. The streets adjusted accordingly. Deals paused. Enemies hesitated. Allies waited. And that was the mistake they made. They thought prison was the end of the story. They didn't realize it was the setup. Because when the call finally came, when the doors opened not for transfer, but for release, it wasn't relief that walked out. It was intention. Bumpy Johnson stepped back into daylight, carrying something heavier than freedom. He carried a message, one forged in concrete and silence, one meant for police captains who smirked, politicians who congratulated themselves, and rivals who thought absence meant weakness. Harlem watched. So did the people who thought they'd won. And none of them were ready for what that message would cost them. The first thing Bumpy Johnson did when he returned to Harlem was walk. No motorcade, no entourage, no celebration spilling into the streets. Just a long, deliberate walk down avenues that had learned how to breathe without him, but never how to forget him. Men standing outside barbershops straightened their backs. Women on stoops paused mid-conversation. A few nodded. Most just watched. Respect didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply recognized what had never left. Harlem had changed, but not enough to hide the damage. New faces occupied old corners. Certain storefronts had unfamiliar protection. The police cruisers lingered longer than they used to, idling like they were waiting for something to go wrong. Someone had been too eager during his absence. Someone had mistaken silence for surrender. That was the challenge. It didn't take long for Bumpy to learn who had filled the vacuum. Captain Thomas Mallory had been promoted while Bumpy was inside, a clean-cut man with a reputation for restoring order. In practice, that meant aggressive raids, public arrests, and a habit of humiliating men in front of their own neighborhoods. Mallory believed in symbols, believed in breaking them publicly, and in Harlem, there had been no larger symbol than the man who had just walked back into the light. Mallory made sure word traveled. He ordered patrols to stop Bumpy twice in one day. No charges, no cause. Just inconvenience wrapped in authority. Officers lingered longer than necessary, hands resting too close to their holsters, smiles just short of daring him to react. Bumpy didn't. That worried them more than anger ever could. Behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. Old alliances felt tested. Younger hustlers questioned whether patients still paid. Some whispered that the city had finally grown tired of legends. Bumpy heard all of it and said nothing. The real test came 3 nights later. The Club Savoy had always been neutral ground, music, liquor, and diplomacy under low lights. That night, the band played softer than usual. The crowd sensed something coming. When Bumpy entered, conversations died the way candles did when the air disappeared. Captain Mallory chose that moment to make himself seen. He walked in with 2 plainclothes officers and the kind of confidence that came from believing the law was an audience, not a limit. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He stood close enough to Bumpy for the words to land exactly where they were meant to. Enjoying your freedom while it lasts. The room froze. Bumpy turned slowly, eyes level, expression unreadable. For a moment, it looked like he might walk away. That would have been the smart move, the safe move. Mallory smiled like a man who mistook restraint for fear. You know, Mallory continued, voice carrying just enough. Prison has a way of shrinking men, reminding them who they really are. Bumpy leaned in just slightly. And what's that, Captain? Mallory's smile thinned. Someone the city's done with. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Disrespect didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered, confident it would go unanswered. Bumpy stepped back. Then you won't mind if I stay? The band resumed playing, uncertain. Mallory lingered another second, then turned and left. But the damage was done. The challenge had been issued publicly. And everyone in that room knew how these stories ended. The question wasn't if there would be a response. It was where. The following week, pressure tightened from every direction. Permits were delayed. Businesses friendly to Bumpy were cited for violations that hadn't mattered before. Old cases were reopened. Men were pulled in for questioning and released just shaken enough to talk. The message was systematic and clear. The city was done negotiating. Mallory believed in escalation. Bumpy believed in timing. He spent his days listening to shop owners, to mothers, to men who'd grown too bold during his absence. He learned which lines had been crossed and which ones could still be walked back. Harlem wasn't asking for violence. It was asking for balance. And balance required an answer. The answer came on a grey morning outside the courthouse. Mallory arranged it deliberately, a parole compliance hearing disguised as routine procedure. Reporters were tipped off. Officers filled the steps. The captain himself stood front and center, coat pressed, posture practiced. When Bumpy arrived, he did so alone. Mallory stepped forward, voice amplified by the stone walls behind him. Mr. Johnson, he said, loud enough for cameras, given your history, the city believes continued oversight is necessary. Oversight meant control, surveillance, restrictions designed not to rehabilitate, but to remind. Bumpy looked at the officers, at the cameras, at the people who had gathered, some by chance, some by hope. Then he looked at Mallory. You brought me out here to embarrass me, Bumpy said calmly. That means you think embarrassment is power. Mallory's jaw tightened. Power is the law. Bumpy nodded once. Then you better make sure the law's clean. The murmur spread instantly. Mallory ordered him escorted inside, but the moment had already shifted. Words had weight when spoken without fear. And the city, for all its authority, hated one thing above all else. Being seen. Because behind Mallory's confidence were deals no one talked about. favoritism disguised as enforcement, raids that missed certain establishments, a career built on selective blindness. Bumpy knew. And now so did the people watching. The confrontation hadn't peaked yet, but it was close enough to smell. The city pretended nothing had changed. Police reports kept coming. Permits stayed delayed. Mallory went on record twice that week, speaking about law and order with the confidence of a man who believed repetition could replace truth. But beneath the surface, the ground had begun to shift. Harlem felt it in the way conversations paused when uniforms passed, in the way officers avoided certain blocks at night, in the way men who had once bragged now spoke more carefully. Bumpy Johnson had not made a move, and that unsettled everyone. Because when a man known for precision chose patience instead, it meant he was counting something. Not days, not favors, weaknesses. He spent evenings in back rooms where no music played. He listened to men who had nothing to gain by lying. A former clerk from the records office. A beat cop one bad decision away from losing his pension. A lawyer tired of pretending certain cases were random. Patterns emerged. Mallory's rise hadn't been clean. No rise ever was. He had leaned hard on Harlem while quietly easing pressure elsewhere. Raids that missed Italian-owned clubs by minutes. Evidence that disappeared just long enough. Promotions greased by results that looked good on paper and ugly on the street. It wasn't corruption in the dramatic sense. No envelopes exchanged in alleys. No late-night phone calls demanding favors. It was worse. It was selective justice. And selective justice always created enemies. Bumpy didn't rush to expose it. Exposure without leverage was just noise. He needed a moment, one where Mallory couldn't talk his way out, one where the city's own rules would have to look in the mirror. That moment came sooner than expected. A young numbers runner named Isaiah was pulled off Lenox Avenue and beaten badly in custody. No charges filed. No explanation given. The boy's mother went to the precinct and was told to be grateful it wasn't worse. By morning, half of Harlem knew. By afternoon, Mallory knew Bumpy knew. He summoned him, not quietly this time. The meeting was set at the 28th precinct. Fluorescent lights, polished desks, framed commendations lining the walls like armor. Mallory sat behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, projecting approachability the way a blade projected sharpness. Bumpy was escorted in and left standing. "Sit," Mallory said, gesturing to a chair that felt intentionally too low. Bumpy didn't move. "You beat a kid to prove a point," Bumpy said evenly. "That's not law. That's panic." Mallory's smile vanished. "Careful," he said. "You're not in a position to lecture anyone." Bumpy leaned forward just enough to change the air. "You don't call meetings unless you're worried," he said. "So let's not pretend." Mallory stood abruptly. "I call meetings when I want to remind people where the line is." "And I'm standing," Bumpy replied, voice calm, "because I don't see one." For a long moment, neither spoke. The room felt smaller than it was. Mallory finally exhaled. "Here's how this ends," he said. "You keep your head down. Stay quiet. Maybe you grow old. Maybe you don't. But Harlem stops looking at you like an answer." Bumpy studied him. "You think this is about me?" he said. "That's why you're going to lose." Mallory laughed. Sharp, humorless. "Lose to who?" Bumpy turned toward the door. "To the people you keep reminding who you really are." The following night, the streets answered. It didn't start as a riot. No fires, no shouting, just silence. Businesses closed early, lights dimmed, music stopped. Patrol cars rolled through blocks that felt abandoned, radios crackling with uncertainty. Then came the complaints. City council offices flooded with calls. Community leaders demanded meetings. Ministers who had stayed neutral suddenly spoke publicly. The press, sensing blood, began asking why certain raids never crossed certain avenues. Mallory dismissed it as agitation until Internal Affairs opened a preliminary inquiry. Quietly, unofficially. And suddenly, Mallory wasn't smiling anymore. He tried to push back, harder stops, harsher enforcement. But it only made the contrast clearer. Harlem wasn't resisting the law. It was questioning it. That was dangerous territory for a man whose power depended on appearing unquestioned. Bumpy stayed visible but untouched. He attended funerals, sat in the front pews, spoke rarely, but when he did, people leaned in. He never mentioned Mallory by name. He didn't have to. The pressure came to a head at a public safety forum arranged by City Hall. A last-ditch attempt to calm tensions. Mallory was asked to attend. So was Bumpy. They were seated on opposite sides of the room. Cameras rolled. A councilman spoke about cooperation, about healing, about moving forward. It was all carefully empty. Then a woman stood, Isaiah's mother. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply described what her son looked like when she saw him in the hospital. She named the officers involved. She asked one question. Who watches the men who say they're protecting us? The room went silent. Mallory shifted in his chair. Bumpy didn't move. The moderator looked panicked. The councilman cleared his throat. The moment teetered. And then Mallory spoke. Allegations will be investigated, he said stiffly. But we will not allow criminals to dictate how this city is policed. The word criminal hung in the air. Bumpy rose slowly. He didn't raise his voice. You already let criminals dictate it, he said. You just chose which ones. That was the spark, not because it was loud, because it was true. Mallory stood, face tight and pointed. This meeting is over. But it wasn't. It was just beginning. Because the city had now seen them side by side, not as legend and law, but as two men measured by their choices. And only one of them looked steady. The city moved fast when it realized it was losing control of the story. Within 48 hours of the forum, subpoenas began circulating quietly. Not enough to make headlines, not yet, but enough to rattle doors that hadn't been knocked on in years. Internal Affairs questioned officers who had grown used to never being questioned. Records clerks were asked to explain missing paperwork. Over time, logs were examined with fresh eyes. Captain Mallory felt the shift immediately. The confidence that once followed him through precinct halls evaporated. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Phone calls went unanswered just long enough to feel deliberate. And for the first time since his promotion, he realized something chilling. The city was preparing to let him go. But Mallory was not a man who surrendered easily. If the system was going to eat one of its own, he intended to choose the timing and the narrative. And there was only one way to do that. He needed Bumpy Johnson humiliated, publicly. The arrest order came down on a Friday night. The kind of timing designed to minimize oversight and maximize spectacle. A parole violation loosely interpreted. Failure to notify authorities of public appearances. The language was thin, but thin had never stopped a badge before. Mallory led the operation himself. They found Bumpy outside a small restaurant on 125th Street. No crowd, no chaos, just a few men standing nearby, waiting, watching. Mallory stepped out of the cruiser and adjusted his coat. "Ellsworth Johnson," he announced, voice carrying. "You're in violation of your release terms." Bumpy turned slowly. "For eating dinner? For thinking you're untouchable?" Mallory nodded to his officers. "Cuff him." The officers hesitated just a fraction too long. Bumpy extended his hands calmly. "Let's be clear," he said. "You're doing this because you're scared." Mallory stepped closer, face inches away. "I'm doing this because I can." The cuffs closed, and that was when the street filled. Not suddenly, not violently. People emerged from doorways, from windows, from cars that slowed and stopped. Word moved faster than radios ever could. Harlem was watching. Mallory realized too late that this wasn't a win. It was a stage. And stages had a way of turning on performers. The precinct, Mallory made a show of it. Cameras invited, paperwork stacked, officers moving just a little too efficiently. He stood over Bumpy, who sat uncuffed now, posture relaxed, eyes steady. "You had your chance," Mallory said. "You could have stayed quiet." Bumpy looked up. "And let you teach my neighborhood fear?" Mallory laughed. "Fear works." "So does truth." Mallory slammed his hand on the desk. "You think you're some kind of martyr?" "No," Bumpy said. "I think you're sloppy." The word landed harder than any insult. Mallory froze. "What did you say?" Bumpy leaned back. "You rushed this. You skipped steps. You put your name on a move that wasn't clean." Mallory straightened. "I don't answer to you." "No," Bumpy replied. "You answer to them." The door opened. Internal Affairs walked in. Two men, dark suits, no expressions. The room changed instantly. Mallory's mouth opened, then closed. "This is highly irregular?" "So is selective enforcement," one of the men replied, placing a folder on the desk. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." The silence was surgical. Bumpy stood slowly as Mallory stared at the folder. Affidavits, reports, statements, things that had existed for years, waiting for the right moment to matter. Mallory's voice dropped. "You planned this?" Bumpy met his eyes. "I waited." They escorted Mallory out of the room, not in cuffs, not yet, but diminished. The precinct watched as their captain walked past them without command, without certainty. Bumpy was released within the hour. No charges, no apology, but something far more permanent. The following morning, the headlines changed. Not overnight sensationalism, something colder. Words like review, investigation, pattern. The city moved carefully now, as if afraid of breaking something else it couldn't fix. Community leaders spoke openly. Officers requested transfers. Policies were revised quietly. And Mallory placed on administrative leave, indefinitely. Harlem didn't celebrate. It remembered. Men shook Bumpy's hand differently now, not with awe, but with gratitude. Women nodded from stoops. Shopkeepers left lights on later, not because violence had been avoided, but because dignity had been defended. Bumpy never spoke publicly about Mallory again. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. You could cage a man. You could watch him. You could even try to erase him. But you could not strip him of the one thing that made him dangerous. Respect. And respect, once earned in the open, was impossible to quietly take back. Justice didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with paperwork. Slow, deliberate, and impossible to argue with once it began to move. That was the part people rarely understood. Real consequences didn't explode. They settled. They stayed. And they reshaped everything around them. Captain Mallory's administrative leave became a formal investigation. The investigation became hearings. The hearings became testimonies no one could unhear. Officers spoke carefully at first, then more freely. Some were angry. Some were relieved. All of them understood the same truth. The shield didn't protect everyone equally anymore. Mallory resigned before he could be fired. The official statement cited personal reasons. The city thanked him for his service, but no commendation followed, no farewell ceremony, no quiet landing elsewhere. His name disappeared from public mention the way inconvenient truths often did. Harlem noticed, because for once, a man with authority had been removed not by scandal alone, but by exposure, not by violence, but by accountability. And the neighborhood understood the difference. Bumpy Johnson didn't step into the vacuum Mallory left behind. That was the part outsiders didn't expect. He didn't hold court, didn't issue statements, didn't collect favors. He simply resumed his place, visible, present, unshaken. And that presence alone changed the temperature. Police patrols adjusted, fewer aggressive stops, more conversations. The tone shifted from confrontation to caution, not because officers feared Bumpy, but because they now feared being watched. The community felt it immediately. Numbers runners moved without panic. Store owners slept with one eye closed instead of both. Parents let their children stay out a little longer in the summer evenings. Harlem exhaled, not because it had won, but because it had been heard. And Bumpy watched it all from a distance. A man approached him one afternoon outside a church, young, restless, eager. "You could take more now," the man said. "They'd let you." Bumpy shook his head. "That's how you lose what you just earned." Justice to him wasn't about dominance. It was about balance, and balance required restraint. Word of the precinct's reckoning traveled beyond Harlem. Other districts paid attention. Captains became more careful. Prosecutors reviewed files twice. The system, briefly embarrassed, corrected itself just enough to survive. But the memory remained. In back rooms and offices, men spoke about what had happened not as a fluke, but as a warning. Not about Bumpy Johnson's power, but about the danger of underestimating someone who understood both the streets and the rules. Because Bumpy hadn't broken the law to win, he had forced it to look at itself. That was the part no one could undo. One evening, months later, Bumpy stood on his balcony overlooking the street. Music floated up from somewhere below. Laughter followed. Harlem sounded like itself again. A friend joined him, older now, voice quieter. "They'll try again someday," the man said. Bumpy nodded. "That's their nature." "And yours?" Bumpy considered that. "To remind them," he said, "that we're still here." He didn't mean himself. He meant Harlem. The lesson had been delivered without a single shot fired, without a body dropped, without a speech written for history books. Just patience, timing, and the refusal to be diminished. That was justice, not revenge. Years later, men would argue about the moment Bumpy Johnson became more than a name. Some said it was earlier, the deals he survived, the wars he avoided, the way he held Harlem together when everyone else tried to carve it apart. Others pointed to prison, to the years behind walls that failed to erase him. But those who truly understood pointed to this chapter, the moment the system blinked first. Because legends weren't measured by how loudly they ruled, but by how quietly they forced change. After Mallory's fall, the city learned a new kind of caution, not fear, calculation. Harlem was no longer treated like an unchecked problem to be managed with pressure and spectacle. It was treated like a place that watched back. That shift didn't come from policy papers or reform speeches. It came from one man refusing to disappear on command. Bumpy Johnson's name stopped appearing in headlines, and that was by design. True power didn't crave attention. It understood the danger of it. Instead, his influence lived in smaller moments. A raid that never came, a case that was quietly dropped, a phone call returned just a little too quickly. People noticed. Young men learned that respect wasn't just about force. It was about discipline, about knowing when to speak and when to wait, about understanding the difference between power taken and power acknowledged. Older men saw something rarer, dignity. Bumpy never pretended to be a hero. He knew his contradictions. He lived them. But in a city that had long confused authority with righteousness, he had drawn a line that couldn't be unseen. You could enforce the law, but you couldn't weaponize it without consequence. That understanding became part of Harlem's bloodstream. Long after Mallory's name faded, the precinct carried his lesson. New captains arrived. Some tried to test the boundaries. None crossed them the same way. The memory lingered, not of humiliation, but of exposure. That was the danger. Harlem didn't need riots to be heard anymore. It had precedent, and precedent was powerful. Bumpy Johnson aged as all men did. His walk slowed, his hair grayed, but his presence never diminished. He had become something less visible and more permanent, a reference point. When disputes arose, men asked not what the law allowed, but what balance required. That was legacy, not statues, not songs, but a standard. One evening, a journalist asked him directly how he wanted to be remembered. Bumpy smiled faintly. "I don't," he said. "I want the neighborhood remembered." That answer never made print, but it circulated anyway, because it explained everything. The city eventually found new problems. It always did. New names, new tensions, new mistakes. But for a time, long enough to matter. Harlem stood differently, straighter, more aware of its worth. And when younger generations heard the story, the one about how they thought Bumpy Johnson was finished and how he walked out carrying a message instead, they didn't hear it as a tale of crime or confrontation. They heard it as a reminder that power didn't always wear a uniform, that justice didn't always shout, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was remain exactly who he was, when the world had already decided he should be gone. This wasn't just a story about one man walking out of prison. It was a story about what happens when authority mistakes silence for surrender and patience for weakness. They thought Bumpy Johnson was finished because that's how the system measured men like him. By cages, by headlines, by how long they could keep a name out of circulation before the streets forgot it ever mattered. But Harlem didn't forget, because this was never about crime or control alone. It was about dignity, about who gets to stand tall when power enters the room, about whether justice is something enforced downward or earned upward. Bumpy didn't win by breaking the law. He won by forcing it to look at itself, by waiting until truth had weight, by understanding that respect, once stripped away publicly, could only be reclaimed publicly and cleanly. No grand speeches, no blood in the streets, no victory lap. just a message delivered with precision. You can watch us, you can cage us, but you will not erase us without consequence. And that's why this moment outlived the men who tried to bury it. Because legends aren't defined by how hard they strike, but by how deeply they shift the ground beneath them. And sometimes, the most powerful response isn't revenge. It's standing your ground until the world has no choice but to adjust around you. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And that's why when they thought Bumpy Johnson was finished, he walked out carrying a message the city never forgot.